Hello and welcome to the British Dapper, and today we're talking about differences between rubber soles. So I received an interesting question the other day about different types of rubber soles to use in the winter months, and the controversy about whether it's formal or informal, and where's the line where something's not formal anymore and more informal when it comes to using rubber soles and treads. So that is the inspiration of today's video. So when it comes to rubber soles, I think you need to think about the origins of it, really. I mean, we talk about Vibram soles and Dainite soles, quite classical ones you'll see now. They are derived from, believe it or not, mountaineering. Back in the day, mountaineering was a very hazardous pastime, and people wore leather hobnail boots, a bit like these ones here, that had metal studs and plates on them, serrated edges to give more purchase on the rocks when climbing. Now anybody that's climbed in their lives, especially in mountaineering, will know that you get wet, cold conditions, ice in places, the rock is permeated with ice and cold water for much of the year in the shaded areas. And metal on solid rock is quite a slippery purchase. And it happened that an individual had lost 3 or 4 close friends falling to their deaths whilst mountaineering. And they engineered the use of rubber to create a rubber-soled mountaineering boot, and that's the origins, because from that then it also came out into normal everyday attire. People were using leather-soled shoes and they migrated to rubber-soled shoes once the technique had been finalized, and manufacturing became much easier. And slowly but surely you see in the 50s and more into the 60s onwards where rubber-soled shoes take over the place of leather, traditional leather-soled shoes. Now this video is more about the formality and where things fit in. So if we look at a traditional formal shoe, this is a leather-soled shoe, and it's an Oxford toe cap, very formal shoe. And the profile of the shoe is really where I think most people will understand formality when it comes to sole units, to the actual shoe itself. Now you can see between my finger and upwards there's a very smooth finish and line, whereas if we looked at a boot as an example, you get a completely different profile. For example here. Now that obviously contributes to the differences, because you can have a black toe cap shoe, an Oxford, but with a chunky tread, and I think that doesn't look as formal as a rubber-soled shoe or a shoe with a straight profile along the bottom. So I've got a selection here and I'll talk you through them along with some examples as well. Now the examples have been provided by a friend of mine, Steve, who works at Timpson's, local shoe repair place and key cutting service. Now, this is not advocating or promoting them in any way. It's just that I have regular use there and I get on well with the staff. Fantastic bunch of lads. And I mentioned about the video and asked if there was any possibility of borrowing some examples, and they were kind enough to allow me to have a few. So starting off, obviously this time of the year, we're autumn, winter time. Leather shoes are great when it's dry. When they're wet, they tend to actually absorb water and get water on them, so the soles draw in water, and that can obviously damage the soles. And when we get into the winter months, when we've got salt added to the water and salt sprinkled on snow and ice, when that melts down, the salt gets into the shoes as well, and that can cause problems as well. So I tend to avoid wearing leather sole shoes when it's wet, purely as a way of preserving my shoes. So that then means using a rubber soled shoe, or a shoe that's got a rubber sole to protect it more from the elements. Now here is a pair of Atomic Prime, full leather shoe, full grain leather shoe, and the actual shoe itself is also a full leather, but you notice that on these they use a rubber pad on the heel unit and on the sole unit, purely to give it purchase and also protect it from the elements. And it's still, although it's a derby, it's a relatively formal shoe. Now, to protect the leather, sometimes you can have an additional sole, a rubber sole added. So these are full leather shoes, but I've had a sole put on them to protect them and to give a little bit of purchase, to make them more slip resistant. And again, when we come to informally, as we start going through brogues, we start getting these are full leather again, and if you can see, we've got a textured sole unit there to give it a little bit more grip and resistance from the elements as well. Lovely pair of shoes these. These sort of retail at around about £200–300, so they're worth protecting, and I thought it was good value to have these added for literally 20 odd pounds, £20–25, not a major amount of money. Obviously when it comes into winter and it gets a little bit more slippy, then you could exchange those for something like this. Now this is a more slip resistant sole unit, and as you can see from the profile, although there is a profile there, it's not a major one. It wouldn't stand out that much, and if you wore that onto the bottom of a leather soled shoe, it would still look formal. And here we have this one here is a winterized sole unit, two soles there, but that gives you that purchase and gives you protection from slipping in icy wet conditions more than a leather soled shoe. So when it comes to boots, here my Oliver Sweeney leather soled boots. These are an Italian design on a chucker boot design, Italian inspired, by Oliver Sweeney. Retail at about 370, 380. Lovely boots to wear when it's dry. I don't really want to wear these in the wet because again it breaks down the sole unit. It can misshape the shoe itself when the shoe gets too wet, and also any salt in the water or in the from the snow protection will actually get absorbed into the leather, and not a very nice thing to happen to a pair of shoes. So I tend to buy something a little bit more cheaper and literally replace those for something that is a rubber soled version. Now I've got black here as a formal look, and as you can see the profile again, this profile we were talking about is quite straightforward. It doesn't look that dissimilar to a full leather sole shoe. This is a Chelsea boot, and it has a slight tread on it to give you protection, a little bit of protection from slippage. But the point being, these are literally 25-30 pounds, and at the end of the season I can put them back into a charity shop and somebody else will benefit from them as well, or keep them for the next season. But again, a viable alternative and not a bad boot to use. Obviously if you want it brown, you can buy them in brown as well. Alternative to that is that you can buy a boot that has a leather sole but with a rubber Dainite sole unit and heel unit placed onto it and sewn on, as you can see there. Yeah. So these are light tan, they're not ideal for the winter, but they will, you know, only because of the colour. They are informal, so they are quite good for jeans, t-shirt, that sort of thing, or jeans and a cardigan, or jeans and a jacket, but not really for going anywhere formally. When we talk about cheap alternatives, here we go, very informal, got a cheap sole on it based on the Commando design sole, and insulated as well, ideal for the winter months. £30, something like that, nothing really extravagant, but great in the winter months. So when we talked about the origins of rubber sole boots and shoes, we come to, for example, Vibram. It's a well-known name. Everybody recognises the yellow logo and the actual rubber sole itself. They have different designs, but the Vibram is the manufacturer's name for that particular module, if you like. This sole unit has specifically made with traction and grip in mind. Now the composites in the rubber itself can change from boot to boot. Now if you're in a hot climate, rubber softens and it becomes very malleable and flexible. If you're in snow conditions and in the Arctic, it becomes very rigid. So therefore, depending on the purpose that you're going to be using them, depends whether you get a hard rubber or a soft rubber finish to start with, and how it reacts to heat and cold. So in this case we have a Vibram sole. Now if you remember, if you look up here, we mentioned about the origins of the mountaineering boot changing to rubber soles. Now you notice the tread pattern on that. The studs used on there are like a crisscross stud. And this is where the combat sole came into origin. It was this that was originally in metal studs and leather and metal strappings, and this was replaced by a rubber version, and this was attached to a leather boot, and this became world known as the Commando sole. And this was based in the Second World War, where commando boots were hobnail boots, and then they had this attached underneath it, glued on and screwed on to give it a more winterized mountaineering vibe, because the commandos in their days were trained for all types of terrain. So they were trained for mountaineering as well as in the desert. So the shoe and the boots that they used were adapted for that purpose, and the best design they came up with was the same used for the mountaineering side, and that was the Commando sole. So this, when we come to Dainite, it's another brand name. Again, it is a brand name, but the actual design, the rubber patterning and the shapes of this is the golf stud version. A lot of people recognize that. It's become more and more popular nowadays. But this is another Dainite sole, and this is the Commando style. So Dainite and Vibram, they don't just have one design, they mix them depending on what you're going to wear and use them for. Now bear in mind we're talking about function, so when it comes to informal, I would say when it comes to rubber boots, this is more formal, and up to this point you're fine. After that, I think it becomes more informal, because either because of the design of the boot. This has got a nice profile here, but because of the design of the boot, that makes it informal to wear. With our cheap version, this is informal. You can see the tread clearly here. It's not a desirable look for a formal boot, although it has a Commando style rubber sole. So this is the far end of the formal trail. Obviously this is specifically designed for walking, and therefore it has a different sort of sole, but again this Vibram sole is designed for a specific function and purpose. So you find that it tapers off at the back end for heel, and it's rounded off here for the curvature of the foot when you're walking, to make it more ergonomic when you're walking. So that is basically a range of shoes, going from full leather all the way down to very informal cheap rubber boots that are the way forward for saving your expensive shoes and boots. If you've got shoes and boots that are let's say from £100 to £500 is a reasonable push for a pair of shoes, and boots are not dissimilar, up to say £700. You know, that's a hefty investment. You don't really want to end up at the end of the year having to replace them because they're so damaged by the salt or by the water penetrating them and they've lost their shape. Then it is a compromise that you switch maybe to rubber soled units and look for something that is going to protect your shoe from those elements. So depending on how bad the weather is, if it's nice and dry, then yeah, I'm going to wear the leather soled shoes. But if it starts getting wet and it starts getting icy and then it starts getting snowy and then you get that slush and the salt in the slush where it's melted, then I become more and more along the lines of this, all the way down to something more like this sort of sole unit here. Not forgetting, you can have a winterized version put onto a leather sole shoe, and the profile, albeit you can see that there is a profile there, it's not dramatic, doesn't stand out a lot, and you probably still get away with wearing that even in a formal setting. So I hope that answers your questions on the difference between rubber and the designs. And if you like the video, give us a thumbs up. If you'd like to subscribe, then please feel free to do so. If you like notifications, then simply hit the bell. We love constructive comments, so if you'd like to make one, jot it down below and we'll come back to you as soon as we can possibly do so. If you have a suggestion for another video, then please also jot that down. We could take into consideration comments for our next series of videos, and so we welcome any constructive comments you'd like to make. So until next time, take care.